Welcome. We're going to be talking about the Bhagavad Gita, and we're going to start with the story itself and some great takeaways that I think can be beneficial to all of us in our lives if we keep them in mind, whether you're religious or not, I might add. And after that, we're going to go on. We're going to talk about the different yogas and margas because they are presented in the Bhagavad Gita as well. And afterwards, we'll talk just a little bit about the relationship of Krishna to Vishnu. The Bhagavad Gita is a story that features the avatar Krishna, who is an avatar of Vishnu, and it features a prince named Arjuna. Now, the setting of the story, there's a lot of incidents that lead up to a battle. A big battle is going to happen, and the battle is taking place between armies that represent two sides of the same family. Each army is led by opposing cousins. And what has happened is the king has a son who is disgruntled because the one who is chosen to be king after the present king is actually the king's nephew from another side of the family. And the king's son, of course, is not happy with this. And there are many events of conflict, but they're ending up in a big battle. And so we start on the one side of the battlefield, and we have Prince Arjuna, and he is actually a brother, trying to think here, two brothers younger, I guess, than the oldest brother in his family, who is the one who is supposed to be king. And on the other side of the battlefield is the son of the king who thinks he should be king. And so Arjuna is in his chariot with his faithful chariot driver Krishna, someone that he very much respects, but he does not realize at this point that Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu. This is going to be one of those Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans shock and awe type episodes later on in the story when Krishna reveals himself as Vishnu and shows Arjuna all of his glory. And and we won't talk a lot about that, but it very much falls in the that theme that we talked about that Rudolf Otto called the Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. So let's talk about the story here. Arjuna is having a horrible dharmic dilemma. And dharmic dilemma, well, dharma is a responsibility or a duty, social, ethical, whatever. And a dharmic dilemma would be there's some question about what the greater responsibility is. And Arjuna actually is weighing out two different responsibilities. First of all, he is a Kshatriya. He is a prince. He's nobility. He's a warrior. He's of the ruling class. And it is his job to fight to protect his kingdom, protect his people, whatever. And but Arjuna has a real problem with the fact that he's getting ready to go into battle against his own family. And there is another ethic that you don't want to do any harm to your own clan. I mean, on the other side of the battlefield, he sees family members, he sees people that in the past have been his friends, and it just seems wrong that he is going to go into battle trying to slay them all. And so he really needs some guidance. And Krishna, again, his faithful chariot driver that Arjuna does not yet know, is an avatar of Vishnu, but is going to soon find out, is going to help answer his question. So one thing I want to say, first off, is this isn't a problem of courage, at least not courage, in terms of I don't want to fight, I don't want to die. It's not that kind of thing. He certainly does not want to slay his own family members and former friends and things like that. So, but it's not really a courageous thing. It's an ethical thing. And there are many ethical dilemmas that we face in life. And we'll talk about some examples. There's many, if you want to use the Hindu term, there's many dharmic dilemmas that we will face in life. Some people seem to skate through life and, I don't know, they don't seem to give much weight to these ethical issues. They just make the best decision and move on. And sometimes you might look at these people and say, oh, they're so much more well-adjusted. They've got the tiger by the tail, so to speak. That's not really the case. When you look at the fact that Arjuna has this deep dharmic dilemma, it's not because of some problem with him. it actually is a good thing. I mean, he is an ethical person who sees a real problem in what is getting ready to happen. And so the reason he has this dilemma is because he is a good person at heart and does not want to do this horrible thing. And yet it's his dharma. This is what he has to do. And it doesn't seem right. There are many times in life where it just doesn't seem right that you should have to do what is in front of you. It's not fair, it's distasteful, and you wish there was some way that you could get out of it. And I guess sometimes you can get out of some situations, whether you should or you shouldn't, but some situations you can't get out of. So the first thing I want to talk about here is Krishna's response to Arjuna. It falls in a couple categories here. First of all, there's something that is kind of linking dharma to determinism, if you will. And this might be the more, maybe the more religious response, I guess. If you happen to be a monotheist that believes that, you know, God is in control of your life and provident and so on, then that would make sense to you. But there are some people that are atheistic that also are kind of fans of determinism. Determinism means that things are going to happen the way they're going to happen. And you might think that you have a lot of free will, but that actually is largely an illusion. There are too many forces outside of your control, too many things that you don't know, and you really cannot control things by your will the way you think you can. Determinism can also be called fate, if you will. If you want to look at it in the old Greek sense, the fate of each person is something that, well, we're not quite sure. Many people in the ancient Greek myths are trying to change their fate, but most of them in trying to change their fate actually end up causing their fate. It's one of the reasons they call these things tragedies. They really are. Another term you might have heard, especially if you are monotheistic, would be predestination. Now, predestination, in a sense, is the same thing as determinism, but predestination implies that there is some being, a sovereign being or something, that is destining you. There's some power that's destining you to something. And so it does kind of fit better with monotheism. Determinism kind of covers all the bases. It just means that there's a chain of events that are out of your control. And so this is one of the aspects. And as Arjuna is wrestling with fulfilling his dharma, Krishna makes it known to him that the outcome of this war is already determined, and Arjuna can't change it. In fact, he goes so far as to say, all of your enemies are already dead. So, in a sort of timeless sense, this war has already been fought, you know, perhaps before the dawn of creation, and the outcome is absolutely assured, and no matter what Krishna does, the outcome's going to be the same. Whether he fights the battle or whether he turns around and rides away, the outcome is the same. So, in a sense, he does not have a choice that is going to change the outcome. And so now we're going to take this concept and put it together with his responsibility to fulfill his dharma. As distasteful as it may be, all of those people on the other side that he wishes he didn't have to kill are going to die anyway. So if he turns around and rides away, it's not going to save their lives. It's not going to end the battle. It's not going to do anything. He's just rejecting his own dharma. And if you want to look at it in a religious sense, it's almost like he's been destined to appear in history at this time to fulfill this function. This is why he exists. This is why he's here. And the only choice he has is to act according to his dharma, according to his responsibility, although it is, of course, grievous to him. Now, this is kind of important because, you know, once you realize that you don't really have a choice in a sense, it relieves you of some responsibility. Not that you're looking to be relieved of responsibility necessarily, you just want to make the right decision. But sometimes you really don't have a choice. I mean, have you ever had to do something that in the end really offends a friend or makes them feel like you were doing something against them, and yet you were in a situation where you had no other choice? I mean, ethically speaking, just in terms of your own power, there was only one thing that you really could do. There was no other option that was, you know, even a possibility. And you might say to your friend, it's like, look, I'm sorry, but I had no choice, you know? Have you ever felt that way? Sometimes you don't have a choice. And so this is one of these things right here. Now, moving on here, there is this idea of karma, and that is that each of our actions, of course, have a reaction. And Arjuna, going into a battle, you know, killing his brethren, people from his own clan, that certainly must have some bad karmic results, right? And but Krishna actually kind of redefines karma in a sense here in a way that's very, very helpful. He tells Arjuna that he must separate himself from the results of his actions. Now, I've learned from teaching this course for many years that the first time I say that statement, monotheists usually take it wrong. Separate yourself from the result of your actions. Are you saying that, you know, you have no responsibility for what your actions cause? No, not saying that at all. Not even close. In a sense, it's saying act while renouncing the fruits of your actions. In other words, if you are acting looking to accomplish something that you think is going to add to your value or make you a success or commend you, then that's what you're seeking to get out of your action. And your motives aren't pure. You're self-interested. So when we say separating yourself from the result of your actions, the idea that Krishna is presenting is this, and we'll talk about it more, but here's the basic idea. Those who act selfishly, that is with regard to self, trying to accomplish some outcome that will somehow benefit them or add to their value or make them look more like a success in society, and I might add that society's criteria for success is deeply, deeply flawed. We'll talk about that. But those who act with self-interest, selfishly, are bound to the effects of their actions. If they're acting seeking to be a success or a failure, well, then those actions are going to define them. Not in a correct assessment, of course, but in this flawed society we live in, it will end up being your identity in some sense. You will be bound to those things, and you'll be bound internally too, unable to separate yourself from them, especially if you're successful. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. On the other hand, those who act selflessly without seeking personal benefit are free from the karmic effects. They are not accruing bad karma, because the bad karma is really coming from choosing to act with a primary intent to benefit yourself. Then any damage that is caused creates tons of bad karma for you because you were willing to cause that hurt, that pain, that injustice, whatever, to benefit yourself in some way, if only to feel better about yourself or whatever. And so when you act selfishly like that, the action is going to affect your self-value, your self-identity, usually by wrong standards with which society judges. And you are going to be defined by the outcome because you sought to be defined by it. That's what you wanted. And karma, in a sense, is kind of saying, okay, you know, you want this action to define you, it will. But I mean, long after society has judged you by its flawed standards, you're going to be judged, you know, cosmically by what you tried to accomplish here. And obviously, after this life, that judgment is going to be a whole lot more just and righteous. So, double-edged sword, if you will. So again, those who act selfishly are bound to the effects of their action, but those who act selflessly without seeking personal benefit are free from the karmic effects. The karmic effects come when you act according to self, and you think that this action is somehow going to affect your self-value or your self-identity. Then you are defined by the outcome. Whether it's good or bad, you are defined by the outcome. Now, let's talk a little bit about outcomes in themselves. Are we fully responsible for the outcome of our actions? No, not at all. The truth is there are many forces out of your control. And there are also many things you don't know. I mean, if you knew everything, you might be able to make a better decision, but even then there are forces outside of your control. And sometimes you try to accomplish something very good, and yet everything goes awry. It turns out very badly. I'm sure everybody can relate to this. Have you ever seen a situation where a friend was disadvantaged somehow, and you thought that's not right, and you want to get involved in that situation and try to Try to help your friend out somehow. Try to be a blessing. Try to help the situation turn out in a better way. Your intent is good. You just want to help. You know, maybe you're not necessarily getting anything out of it except maybe a thank you for your friend, but that's not why you're doing it. You genuinely care about your friend. But there are forces outside of your control. And even though your intent is good, your actions do not turn out the way you've envisioned them. That good outcome that you've envisioned, you do not have the power and the knowledge to make happen. And things go horribly awry. And here's the really insulting thing, and that is sometimes in a situation like that, you may have had a friend that comes back and says, "What did you do?" And you're like, "I was just trying to help." And your friend says, "Never help me again. In fact, never see me again." Life is full of situations like that, where your intent is confused with the outcome of your action. See, it's possible to intend something very good and yet have horrible things happen. And so this is a big problem in how our society judges a person to be a success or failure, because even though there are forces outside of our control, and we really can't take credit for the outcome of our actions, we are judged by the outcome of our actions in human society. In other words, if based on society's criteria, and I'm not going to go ahead and articulate them, we've talked a lot about that before, but if based on society's criteria, you have been successful in accomplishing something that society thinks is worth accomplishing, society doesn't just say, "Oh, you've been successful." No, society says, "You are a success." That becomes your identity as a person. And so you are inextricably linked to the outcome of your actions. On the other hand, if you try to do something, and we're not even talking about intent yet, you might be trying to do something with the best of intentions, but if you try to accomplish something and you fail to accomplish that thing that you wanted to accomplish due to forces out of your control or maybe no fault of your own, still you failed to accomplish the outcome that you intended. But society doesn't tend to look at you and go, "Oh, you failed." They tend to look at you and go, "You are a failure." And again, you know, your identity is inseparable from the result of your actions. Now, obviously, this is wrong, and you can probably already think of some good reasons why it is wrong. Are we not much more than the outcome of our actions? And scholars and theologians and visionaries from so many different religions have addressed this issue. Even in Christianity, I mean, there are mystics that have pointed out that, you know, we are much more than the results of our actions. So if the actions are out of our control, then that must be the case, right? So what are we then? What is it that we can control? Maybe it might be difficult. Maybe it might take some discipline. But the only thing that I can really control to some degree is me. I can choose who I want to be, and I may have to work very hard to become that person if I have a whole bunch of, defining events in my life that have caused me to react in other ways. But people can make progress in becoming better people. The question here is, what is your intent? So what of ethical intent? Okay, we know the difference between ethical and unethical. According to all of the world religions, they would all agree on certain things, and that is, if you are caring for your neighbor, if you're trying to do something to be of service, to be a blessing, seeking to love your neighbor as yourself, then that's good ethical intent. On the other hand, if you're engaging in an action to benefit yourself and you're actually willing to have other people hurt in the process of this, to gain whatever good you wish for yourself, then that is unethical action, because you're not seeking good for others. You're only seeking good for yourself, and you're willing to damage them for your own good. So pretty simple. So now let's look at intent. Let's say that I have an ethical intent. What if I truly sought to do good, but failed due to forces outside of my control? Society might say, I'm a failure. Let's talk about someone else. What if there was someone else whose intent was basically selfish? Maybe they tried to start a new corporation or a new industry, and they thought, man, we're going to make lots of money, we're going to dominate the market, whatever. And the person ends up being wildly successful, and almost inadvertently, because of the product they developed or the way it's able to deal with some problems in society or whatever, what they have done, the company they've made, the product they've developed, the technology they've pioneered, ends up being a blessing to many people. It was not their intent to be a blessing, really, to anybody but themselves. They sought to do something that would benefit them. They wanted to be a success. And so if what they've done ends up blessing so many people, but that wasn't their intent, do they get credit for that? Now compare that to the first person who really wanted to do good, but failed due to forces outside of their control. And someone says, you're a failure. And the person who really only cared about themselves, but just kind of accidentally is a blessing to other people, people say you're a success. And that is completely disregarding someone's ethical intent. And I'm sure you know enough to know that that's not fair and that's not right. Who was the success as a person? I'll say it again, as a person. Because if you're going to separate yourself from your outcome, and you're going to realize that outcomes are largely out of your control, right? Some people who don't deserve to have a good outcome, everything works out well for them, and other people who are trying to do something really good, everything backfires and goes haywire. So we know this isn't fair. So if you're separating yourself from the results of your action, what makes you as a person a success or a failure? I mean, by true standards, okay? When you're considered to be a success, you're actually in a worse position than if you're considered not to be a success in terms of society's standards. Now, we already can kind of see the right standard of success, right? It should be my intent. Did I want to do good? Did I want to do something good? Okay? And did I want to do something evil? So the first thing you can do is say that it's intent. The first way that this is helpful in life is that if you know that your intent was good, and yet because of forces outside of your control or information you didn't possess or whatever, the good thing that you tried to do, you could not accomplish, but you know that your intent was good, you got to give yourself a break. Whatever went wrong with the outcome of your actions is not going to accrue to you. Now, again, in the case of Hinduism, he's talking about bad karma here, but this far transcends Hinduism. I mean, we're always making decisions about, you know, who we are and what kind of person we are and who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to do and how do I affect other people. And so when you start looking at intent and realize that sometimes you can intend great things and they turn out badly, it's easier to give yourself a break when they turn out badly. What if you recognize that your intent is the most important thing, and then you're very, very successful, and you have a wonderful outcome? You actually might be in a worse situation than the person who tried to do good and failed. Why? Because remember, society is going to, and we've learned to do this, by the way, we are society. Society is going to judge you by the outcome of your actions. So, when you are considered to be a success, you've been successful, you're considered to be a success. Think about what that's like. You go to a theater and you sit down in a seat, and finally someone comes out and, you know, it's the guest speaker of the night, the person you've come to see, you've read their books, you love them, whatever. And someone comes out and introduces them, and as they introduce them, they kind of give this list of like all of their accomplishments. They won the Peabody Award, and they won this, and they won that, and that, and that, and you know, and finally, you know, here he is or she is, and what you've just been told is all the reasons why they're on the stage, and you should listen to them because on some level they're considered to be more successful than you, and it gives them the right to stand on that stage. And the wrong conclusion that people come to, if you're thinking that the outcome is connected to the person, is that if I was as good a person as they are, I would have the success that they had. And of course, that's a completely flawed conclusion, because there's too many forces outside of your control. The person up there who looks like they're a wonderful person because they bless so many people, you can't even see into their heart and know that they even had the ethical intent. But let's assume they did have the ethical intent. Let's assume they wanted to be a blessing and they were successful in doing it, and now everybody looks at them and says they're a success. Okay? They're being deluded. They're tempted to believe, and they're probably very much succumbing to the temptation to believe that they're a success because they were successful, because to believe that they're a good person because the outcome of their actions was good. They're tempted to believe that. And the thing is, when you're considered to be a success, there's no desire to change. You have no motivation to look more deeply. You don't see anything unfair. You don't see anything amiss. You like the fact that, you are a success, and you begin to believe you deserve it, and you begin to believe that the success you had in these actions somehow should define you. I should be recognized as a success because what I did. And these people are the ones that are the most bound because they don't really have a good reason to look more deeply. Now, let me say this. Many of them eventually do, because what they find out is that after a long period of success, which they had always thought was going to fulfill them and make them happy, they're feeling just as empty and unfulfilled and unhappy as they were before. And so something like that can cause them to finally look and try to discover the truth about why this success doesn't make them ultimately feel successful. So some of them will get out of the trap, and it's always great when someone does. But still, they're in the worst position because everything society is telling them about themselves is like, you're good, you're what you're supposed to be, you couldn't have done any better, this is wonderful. But now think about the other person, the person who maybe tried to do something good, really wanted to help, and yet they weren't able to accomplish what they tried to, and they're considered to be a failure. It's not just that they failed in their attempt, but as a person, somehow this defines them. Hi, I'm Steven Meigs, I'm a failure. Something inside me, if I'm the person in this story, knows that's not right. Because I know that I intended good. I know my intent was good. And by the way, my intent is still good. I only want to bless people. I never wanted to hurt anybody. I'm willing to make sacrifices, and put other people first if I can just be a blessing. So when society looks at me and says, you're a failure, that doesn't feel right to me. And so I am driven to look more deeply. I am driven to, understand this delusion. I'm driven to find the truth and free myself from this delusion because something in me knows that this is not right. This is not fair. This is not who I really am. If you can see that something is a delusion, you're much more likely to seek to find out what is true, what is real. So, in a sense, the person who's trying to be a good person yet somehow has been falsely branded as a failure is actually in a better position. And I mean, I'm talking about their ultimate overall good. And if you're religious, in terms of the results after their life, whatever they are, final judgment or reincarnation or whatever, this person is actually in a much better position than the person society says is a success, because we like feeling like a success. And if someone says, this is who you are, and I like what they're telling me I am, I'm much less likely to acknowledge that this might actually not be true, and that I should think more deeply. Again, dissatisfaction, non-fulfillment, unhappiness, when I've accomplished everything that I thought was going to make me happy, can lead me to seek the truth. So there are many people that are esteemed to be successful that later on find very little fulfillment, and they do actually seek the truth, and they do actually end up being a blessing to many, many people because they actually talk about the events that caused them to start investigating and the different progress they made, the procedure they went through, the process in coming to this enlightenment, this disillusionment or whatever, and many people are inspired by that. And so certainly hope that you're inspired that it's okay to attempt to accomplish things as long as your intent is good. If forces outside of your control or knowledge outside of your acquisition is largely responsible for you failing to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish, you're not a failure as a person, because your intent was good. You tried to do something good. Now hear me. The only failure as a person is an ethical failure. I'm going to say it one more time. Never forget it. The only failure as a person is an ethical failure. I don't care how badly your project bombs. If you sincerely wanted to help other people and be a blessing, and that was much more important than anything that you derived from it, I don't care how badly your project bombed. You're not a failure. You're a success because you acted with correct intent and you envisioned something that would be good for other people, and that's what you really desired to be. You're a success, no matter how much society says you're a failure. On the other hand, you're driving around in a really nice car, and just due to situations outside of your control, you look like you've just done everything right and you deserve what you got. You're deluded and you're blind. And I hope that there's something in your life that causes you to look a little bit deeper. Not so you would feel bad about yourself, but so you would find good reasons to feel good about yourself. So that you could really be a good person, not just look like one according to a flawed standard of society. Outer action with inner renunciation is the secret to the life of freedom. That's what Krishna would say. Let me say it one more time. Outer action with inner renunciation is the secret to the life of freedom. What's inner renunciation? It means I renounce any benefits of this in terms of how it adds to my value as a person. I renounce the benefits. I renounce the fruits of this endeavor myself. So outward action with inner renunciation is the secret to the life of freedom. The life of freedom. There are a lot of people that look very, very free. And they've got all of the power and all the money and the position and everything that should give them great liberty in this society, much greater than the vast majority of society, and yet they're the most bound in many, many ways. And but if you truly can embrace this idea, you're courageous in action. You're not, you're not worried about being devastated if what you're trying to do goes awry, because you realize you're not defined as a person. Your value as a person truly is not determined by the outcome of your actions. It's determined by the intent of your heart. The only failure as a person is an ethical failure. All right, let's go on and talk about the different yogas or margas. I'll put myself down here in the corner. The 4 yogas or margas. First of all, yoga is a term that literally means yoke. And I guess the original meaning of yoke would be a big beam of wood put across the shoulders of a team of oxen to get them, as they are tilling the field or whatever, to move in the same direction at the same speed so that their power can be combined in the most effective way. And so yoke also has the idea of a union. If you're yoked together with someone, you are in union with them. Yoke has often been used as a term for a spiritual discipline, and that's where the term yoga comes from. But by the way, this term is not just used as a spiritual discipline in India. We see it in Judaism too. Maybe you have read the Gospels, and maybe you're familiar with some of Jesus' teachings, but he was considered to be a rabbi in his time, and he had many followers. He had a group of close disciples, and then many others that were learning from his teachings in a less direct way. But he himself says at one point, in contrast to some of the other rabbis that are just saddling their disciples with so much minutia that they have to correctly perform and obey, Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. My burden is light. And what he's saying is that not necessarily that it's easy in the sense that there's no effort, but it's not complicated. It's more of a simple endeavor. My yoke is easy and my burden is light, he says. And so, again, same metaphor, we see it in Judaism here, and of course, embraced by Christianity. So when you think of yoga, if it seems weird to you because you've never done yoga, can think of it as a spiritual discipline. And there's many different kinds of spiritual disciplines. We're going to talk about them here, many different kinds. The second term that's used for a spiritual discipline here is a different word, marga. Marga really means path. But of course, in this case, we're talking about a spiritual path. So your spiritual path, in other words, that's what direction you're going to the goal. Your spiritual discipline, that's whatever kind of method that you are using to try to attain the goal. So in most cases, the words are pretty much interchangeable, especially with the first three that we're going to talk about, jnana, karma, and bhakti. You can say bhakti yoga, you can say bhakti marga. It's the same thing. Okay? Now, when we finally get down to yoga itself, and we're generally talking about Raja Yoga here, at that point you would not use the term marga, okay? Raja Yoga is always called Raja Yoga, but jnana, karma, bhakti, you'll see them called yogas and margas, and it just doesn't make any difference. First of all, let's do jnana. Now, this is the marga or the yoga of knowledge. In other words, you are trying to learn and discover as much as you can about the nature of reality, about the nature of your connection to the ultimate, so that you can develop the greatest harmony with the ultimate that is possible. And there are many different kinds, many different branches. One way to think about jnana that might be helpful for you if you're a monotheist is you might think of a jnana yogi as being a theologian, someone who is very, very well trained and researched in the knowledge of how to attain harmony with the ultimate. Now, how many people in society become theologians, become scholars of theology, or become renunciants who spend their life trying to discover the mysteries of the universe? Not too many. It's a very small percentage. And the reason is this is a very demanding path. It's very, very hard to be successful in jnana yoga if you have a lot of other responsibilities. I mean, if you're the head of a household with a lot of children and you're running a business and everything else, you probably just don't have the time to be successful in jnana yoga. And you may not really see the benefit either. If you go to get the oil in your automobile changed and you happen to listen to the conversations going on in the garage, it would be very strange to hear a couple of the mechanics debating the merits of Aristotelian versus Platonic philosophy. Why? Because it's of no particular benefit to them. It doesn't help them to be a better mechanic, probably doesn't help them to have a better relationship with their wives or children. And so it's something that the limited time they have is not going to be spent pursuing, okay? So you're going to have to make some sacrifices in terms of time to be very successful in this. And so it's going to be a smaller percentage of the population. Now, just like theology in your religion, if you're religious, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Buddhism, there are many different forms. Not everybody in your religion feels the same way about some of these major theological issues. And we have a lot of different theological camps here in the jnana tradition. Usually we separate them into about 8 different ones, but I am not going to talk about all of them. Later on, I'm going to talk about 3. And the reason I'm going to talk about the 3, remember, Vedanta means this is what we think that the sum conclusion of all of the Vedas is, the conclusion found in the Upanishads, and the best way to understand it and apply it. That's Vedanta. And we have actually, even though I haven't told you this, we've been talking about Advaita Vedanta a lot. Advaita Vedanta is born in the axial age when people start thinking about monism. Okay, monistic theologies, monism, that's Advaita Vedanta. Advaita literally means not divided, not dualistic. In other words, monistic. So we've talked about this a lot, and we're going to talk about the progression because these teachings don't, happen in a short period of time and then get concretized. They develop over many centuries, and most of them finally come to a point where they find their superior articulation in the mouth of some scholar or visionary at some point. So we're going to talk about Advaita, but we're also going to talk about 2 different forms of Vedanta called Vishishtadvaita and Advaita. And we're going to do this. This will be one of the last things that we do in this series of videos, second to last thing, actually. So there are a number of different forms of jhanan. Now, karma and bhakti yoga, these are the yogas of the masses. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people that are renunciants. Renunciant, you've renounced your place in society to focus on a spiritual goal. Think monks and nuns and hermits and whatever. I'm not to say that there could not be people who dedicate their entire life to these pursuits, but generally, if you're talking about renunciants, they're going to fall in the jnana category, or definitely in the yoga category, the Raja Yoga category, which we're going to get to. Karma and bhakti are more the margas of the masses, because you can pursue these disciplines, you can take these paths when you do have a job, or you do have a family, or you are in school, or you're involved in so many other things. And so that's why it works well. And by the way, they don't preclude each other. It's certainly possible to try to be a blessing and live a life of service while you are in worship of a particular god. There's nothing that precludes them. Karma means action. And we mentioned this when we talked about karma. Although as a theological concept, when people say karma, they're usually talking about the result of your actions. But karma literally means action. So karma is the marga, or the yoga of action. And when it talks about action, it means ethical action. It means compassionate action, action of service, action where you are trying to be a blessing, where you are trying to increase the quality of life of people who are less fortunate than you are, when you are actively trying to love your neighbor as yourself. And this is a very valid path. Now, we're going to talk a lot later when we get to Christianity about some very, very wrong ideas regarding faith and works and stuff like that. But let me just say here, if your faith doesn't have works, what is it worth? Because people are what is real in this world. And when you're judged by people, it's going to have a lot to do with how you affected them. Were you a blessing to them? Were you a curse to them? And so being a blessing to other person, this is the high road. This is what you want to accomplish. You want to love your neighbor, and you want to love your neighbor in practical ways that actually do benefit your neighbor in some way. To say that I love someone, but I'm going to do nothing, well, you've misunderstood love. You apparently think that love is some kind of a feeling, or maybe you think it's some kind of a theological belief, but that's not true. Love is an action. It's a verb, When you love someone, it means you're doing something to benefit them. And if you're not doing something to benefit someone, then you're not really loving them. It's so much more than a feeling or a belief system. So karma yoga, you've dedicated yourself. What's beautiful about this? That is, wherever you go, you're going to see people that are less fortunate than you, that are needy in some way. And if you don't see them, it's because you're not looking. But the karma yogi is looking for opportunities. Now, some of them might make a whole career of it. They might, start a nonprofit corporation and put all of their hours into developing that corporation that can benefit, millions of people. But very few people have the opportunity to do that. But within your sphere of influence, you will see dozens of people every day. Most people will, if you're going to work or going to the market or going to school or whatever. And you will have opportunities to be of service to people, to be a blessing to people. So again, this is why this is one of the yogas of the masses. Bhakti yoga is the yoga of devotion. If you've ever heard me use the term devotional Hinduism, that's bhakti. Bhakti yoga, bhakti marga. Now remember, in Hinduism, all of the personal gods are manifestations of that great ultimate God principle that is beyond our conception, beyond the universe, beyond space and time, beyond dualistic thinking, beyond everything. And so since we cannot think about who or what Brahman is, in fact, saying who and what, they're just flawed terms to even refer to Brahman, personal gods are what we focus on because that's what we can understand. Now, even in monotheism, the same thing happens, and we've talked about this. The The best Christian and Muslim and Jewish theologians have all acknowledged that God is far beyond our comprehension, you know, and there are many scriptures I could quote out of the Bible, you know, where God is saying, you thought that I was like you, that, you know, I get tired, or you thought that I was like you, that I get tempted with evil, or you thought that I was like you, that I changed my mind. And this is a blessed thing called negative theology. And we mentioned it before. You get a little bit too attached to the symbolism, the personal symbolism of God, which you need to think about God. You need to be reminded by some good doses of negative theology that this metaphor, this symbolism, you're using it because it's what you need, and because God's compassionate, it's okay. But don't think you've defined God, or this is the way God is. This is the way, if you believe in a loving God who humbles himself to reveal himself, this is the way God chooses to reveal himself to you so you can understand him. But this is not what he is, or she is, or it is. Again, I apologize for not having a neuter personal pronoun. Forgive me for using the male one. But the point of the matter is, you need to recognize that whatever you think about God is the product of your imagination, whatever kind of symbolism that you are using to be able to think about God. So that's why there's so many personal gods in Hinduism, because we can think about personal gods. The beauty of it is they're all manifestations of Brahman. So any of them, if you're properly devoted to them, can help you and are willing to help you on your spiritual path towards your goal. Not only your goals in this life or your goals in reincarnation, but certainly your final goal, your Sanatana Dharma, of attaining moksha. Now, you're generally going to have one God that you're going to be devoted to if you're bhakti. This doesn't mean the other gods are bad in any sense. I mean, you know, you respect them all, you love them all. You probably are engaged in holidays that honor many different gods or goddesses or whatever that are not your personal god. So there's no, you know, there's no henotheistic idea that you can't worship other gods. It's not that at all. But any god is a viable path. You may worship Vishnu, I worship Shiva, she worships Kali, she worships Durga. It doesn't matter. They're all manifestations of Brahman. They can all help us on our way. So there need be no conflict about, you know, which god is better or more correct. That just doesn't really exist in Hindu reasoning per se. Now, let's talk a little bit about devotion to personal gods. Obviously, there's many forms of bhakti because there's many, many different gods, and there are different traditions in worshiping different gods, and time would fail us to go into this because there's so many gods. But when you start thinking about personal gods and being devoted to a personal god, sometimes I kind of play a trick on my students, and I ask questions that I know they're going to answer with a 21st century American perspective, just so I can open their understanding. And in previous videos, you've seen examples of this. But sometimes I will ask students, you know, why do you think, you know, some people would choose one god over another god? I mean, what determines the god that you choose, you know, most of the time? And obviously, an answer that I always get is something to the effect of, you know, well, whichever god is, you know, I don't know, most like what you want to accomplish or works the best for you or whatever. And isn't that a 21st century American way of thinking about gods? Like they're genies in a bottle. Let me pick the one that's going to be the best servant for me and help me accomplish what I want to accomplish, because it's all about my will. But then there's a second question that's really revealing, and that is, what might make you switch? What might make you, you know, change the god that you worship? And most people would say, well, you know, if the one god isn't working out for you or something like that, you might try another one. Gee, these don't sound like gods to me. These sound like you're the employer and you're hiring the god, but he's on a probation period. And if you're not happy with his results in the first 90 days, well, then you're going to fire him and hire another god. Wait a minute. Who's the god in this story? You are. You see how we've kind of changed everything around? And why has this happened? Because we live in a pluralistic society. You can choose whatever you want to. And if you want to go to the Baptist church this week and you don't like what they're saying, you can go to the Methodist church the next week. And if you don't like them, you might say, okay, I'm going to go to the Hindu temple. And if you don't like that, you might say, I can go to the Buddhist temple. And if you don't like that, you can say, well, I'm just going to create my own set of beliefs. You can do all of those things. And so what it's done is it has put the consumer in control, and the church has been marginalized. The church is trying to, sell you a product, win your allegiance, just like everyone else that is trying to win your acceptance or sell you a product, whether it's commercial or whether it's political or educational or whatever. Everyone's campaigning for your allegiance in some sense. But you can't be forced to believe any particular thing any more than you should be able to be forced to buy any particular brand of product. You make those kind of choices. So since you have the choice and you're the one making the decision, now the religion is the product and you're choosing what product you want. And so we have a very warped idea of this. And once I point this out, then most of the students will admit, yeah, you're right. We're thinking more of like a genie than we are of like a god that should be bowed before. But these people are not thinking about a genie that comes out of a bottle. They're thinking of glorious gods, and they want to be fully devoted to them because it's the result of their full devotion that causes the god to say, you're worthy, I'm going to help you. They don't have to be perfect, but they do have to be devoted. Their devotion has to be sincere, which brings us to the second question. Why would you ever change the God that you worship? Well, I guess we didn't answer the first question. Let's do that. Why do most people end up with the God that they end up with? Because it's the God their family has worshipped for generations. Okay? Now that brings us to the second question. Why do you stick with that God? Or, more like the question I asked, if you're worshiping one God, why might you choose to try another one? And of course, people say, well, maybe the one isn't working out for me or this or that, But let's think about this. They're personal gods, right? Okay. Number one, they're personal gods. Number two, it's because of your complete devotion to them that they are graciously helping you on your spiritual path, right? So, if you change the God that you worship, are you going to get credit for the worship you gave to another God first? Let me put this in a more familiar metaphor. I was married for a very long time, and after I got divorced, when I got involved in another relationship, I didn't get any credit for all the good things that I did to my ex-wife. My new girlfriend didn't say, how many times did you buy your ex-wife flowers? 597. Oh, I love you so much, Steven. Give me a kiss. It doesn't work that way, does it? Okay? The credits don't transfer. You're starting over again. That's the nature of personal relationships, right? Well, these are personal gods. They're personal manifestations, so you have to treat them as persons. If after, worshiping a god for 20 years, I just basically say, goodbye, and go worship another god, is there some benefit that goes with me? Not necessarily. Full devotion is only full devotion if it's irrevocable, if it lasts throughout your life. So there's no good reason to change the God you worship because you're throwing away the benefit of that devotion to that God. Now, if there were a situation that would perhaps necessitate you worshiping a different God, what might that be? Well, if within your caste and your subcaste and your clan that you're allowed to marry into, according to the classic caste system model, if within your clan that you're allowed to marry into, there happen to be different bhakti traditions, then it might actually be legal for you, as a worshiper of Vishnu, to marry a girl who's a worshiper of Shiva. But your house isn't going to be divided, okay? When the woman comes into your house, she's going to worship Vishnu. In this case, though, the credits will transfer because you are performing the will of the gods by having the family unified. And in this case, so to speak, Shiva's going, good luck in your new life. Daughter, it's been a pleasure having you. And Vishnu's like, welcome, welcome. I think it's wonderful the way you serve Shiva for 20 years. Again, I'm being funny with this, but in that case, the credits maybe would transfer because you are making the proper decision according to your responsibility to your family. So that would probably be the only case where that would happen. Make sense? Anyway, we'll talk more about bhakti in a future video. We're going to talk about different devotional groups, so we'll come back to that in the future there. Now, there's a last yoga And by the way, yoga is one of the 8 schools of Jnana. But when you talk about yoga, you usually think of psychophysical discipline. That means that I'm disciplining my body, but I'm also trying to discipline my mind. Okay? And so by that definition, you could say, okay, yoga is a form of jnana. And many scholars might say that. You might have noticed the footnote down there that some texts include Raja Yoga as one of the philosophical schools of Jnana Yoga, kind of like the different Vedantas. However, I don't think that Raja should be engaged as a division of Jnana, but as a separate category. And the reason is its goals are fundamentally different than Jnana or maybe even some other kinds of yogas. In Jnana, obviously, it's to use all of your mental or intellectual abilities to facilitate your spiritual growth and your harmony with the ultimate. But true Raja Yoga is trying to go beyond that. True Raja Yoga is working sometimes for decades as renunciants, very disciplined renunciants, trying to attain a state that is actually beyond thinking as we know it. They see that the forms of this world, the ways that we conceive of reality in our mind, is something that is very constricting. And so they are trying to actually take control of their mind through a step of processes we'll talk about briefly. They're trying to take control of their mind to the point to where they can go beyond their mind, beyond the forms of this world. They're engaging in a reality and experience. Well, I can't really say experience, because when you're thinking, you remember things and then you can talk about an experience. But if you're not thinking, if you're not experiencing the consciousness of where you are and what you're doing, then technically you're not really making a memory and you're not really thinking about anything. And so there are really no words to explain what this is, but it is an attempt to go beyond the constrictions of your mind and the way you think, to experience a unity with Brahman that cannot be experienced through thought, through reasoning. You want to go beyond it. And so since Jnana, and all the schools of Jnana, even some of the other yogas, are about you're using your full abilities to pursue your harmony with the ultimate. Raja Yoga is about, in a sense, taking power over your mind and going beyond it. And so that's why I think it should be a separate category all on its own. Now, next thing. Some scholars think that when Krishna is explaining to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita these different margas, jnana, karma, bhakti, some scholars say that he is also introducing Raja Yoga in some of the later chapters, and they point out places where they think he's talking about that. But scholars are divided on that, whether he's talking about Raja or something else. But there is a source that is usually considered to be the origin of at least the very specific idea about Raja Yoga as Ashtanga with the 8 different limbs. And this source is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And so Raja Yoga, Raja first of all means a ruler. So it's often called the royal yoga. It doesn't mean it's the yoga of kings. It means it's the king of yogas. It promises the most, but it requires everything. This is a yoga for renunciants. People who are raising families or running businesses, they are not going to be successful in it. It takes too much commitment. And so it's a yoga of renunciants. It is also sometimes called Ashtanga because there are 8 steps we'll look at very briefly. By the way, that ASHT, that prefix there, asht, it would be the same thing as acht. And by the way, if you were in Switzerland or something, it would probably be spelled ACHT. Well, of course, in America here, we would spell that prefix OCT, but we recognize it as the prefix for octagon, and so we recognize it means 8. So there are 8 steps here. When we think of yoga in this country, most of the time we are thinking of steps 3 and 4 of Ashtanga Yoga, whether you're talking about Hatha is one of the more popular ones, but steps 3 and 4 are all about the bodily postures and the breathing exercises and so on. And so that's usually what we think about when we think of yoga. But let's look at the 8 steps of Ashtanga. Let me say one other thing. You will hear some people in the United States of America talk about practicing Ashtanga Yoga. You know what? You want to take an Ashtanga Yoga course. And this is really kind of a misnomer, okay? True Ashtanga is not something that you're going to be practicing, 2 hours a night on Tuesdays and Thursdays after work before you pick the kids up from daycare. It doesn't work like that. You dedicate your entire life to it as a renunciant if you want to have the ultimate goal that Ashtanga Yoga is taking you to. So, Ashtanga Yoga. By the way, you're not going to have to memorize all of these, so freakest thou not. The last two I'm going to want you to remember, but you won't have a hard time remembering them when I get there. First of all, the first two are easy to explain. Yamas, these are basically the restraints, and you can think of them as commandments if you want. And most religions ethically have pretty much the same basic commandments, not to hurt another person, certainly not to murder another person, to be honest, not to steal, not to be covetous, not to be greedy, not to commit adultery, sexual sin. So these are things that you're familiar with. And so self-control and selflessness, loving your neighbor as yourself, doing nothing to transgress against your neighbor. Niyama is the practice of the yamas, internal control and calmness. And again, this is, isn't it something that everybody is looking for in our society? How can I just chill out in the midst of this chaotic storm of life? So we're kind of familiar with this too. The asanas are the bodily postures, most popular being the lotus position. And again, we're familiar with that. There are some bodily postures I've seen, in yoga shows late at night. I mean, it hurts me just to see people doing them. Pranayama are the breath control exercises. By focusing on your breath, you certainly can attain a more peaceful state. When you go beyond this now you're starting to get into the heavier stuff that most people don't accomplish, looking at this in a very departmentalized way as one little section of their life. Control of senses to rule out external distractions. Let's think about this. Ruling out external distractions. Have you ever thought, oh my God, tonight I need to think about nothing but this test that is coming up, or this paper I have to write? I'm focusing on that completely. Does your brain cooperate? Often not. And people often talk about the tyranny of the mind that just will not stop thinking about things that you would rather not be thinking about. So it's difficult to discipline. So even this step, man, we're getting to some hardcore stuff here. Dharana, extreme concentration on a single object. Now, once you can rule out the distractions and you can focus on a single thing, focusing on that single thing can be a doorway to eventually going beyond thinking as we know it. When you're finally getting to close to your goal, jhana is the path you're taking. Jhana means meditation. Okay, and you're seeking to withdraw from all attachments. And when it says attachments, it's not talking about possessions or anything, but it's talking about the way you think. It's talking about the way you think about reality. That's what it's talking about with attachments. And I want you to remember the term jhana, because this term in Sanskrit, in Chinese it's chan, and in Japanese it's zen. Ever heard of Zen Buddhism? Zen Buddhism literally means meditation Buddhism. And we'll talk more about that, but that's the same word here, jhana. It means meditation. And this is the true meditation, where you're not just trying to control your brain, you're trying to withdraw from all the forms of this world and go beyond it. What you're trying to attain is a state called samadhi, a transcendent state beyond the boundaries of human thought, where complete oneness with Brahman and liberation is achieved. Now, that's a mouthful. But the ultimate goal is to have an experience beyond thinking as you know it. Now, some of these experiences are quite temporary, and when people come back from them, obviously they can't tell you what it was like, because if it's beyond thinking, it's beyond concepts, it's beyond memories, but you probably come back feeling marvelously liberated and free. But there are different levels of samadhi, and I'm not going to get into this because it's complicated, and I'm not an expert in it, but there's different levels of samadhi. The ultimate level of samadhi is a level where you experience such a great liberation beyond human thought that it's like you're experiencing moksha while you're still alive. It is the most liberated state that you can experience. It is the closest to moksha, true unity with Brahman, that you can achieve while you are technically still physically alive in this world. Now, I'd like you to remember the term samadhi, and the reason I want you to remember it is because you're going to find out in Zen Buddhism, remember, jhana means Zen, you're going to find out that they have an ultimate goal that's very similar. And it has to do with going beyond thinking as we know it, going beyond the forms of the world. It's a very similar idea. Obviously, they have very different theological explanations for it. They don't believe your soul's in unity with Brahman. That is something Buddhists completely reject. But it seems to be a very similar kind of experience. So when we get to Zen Buddhism, we're going to look at their idea of samadhi. So those are the two terms I would like you to remember. Good? Last thing. There is one particular verse in the Bhagavad Gita that I would like to point out here. First, let me just remind you that we are talking about Krishna as the avatar in this story, and he, of course, is an avatar of the great god Vishnu. And so the Bhagavad Gita is especially precious to Vaishnava. Those are people that worship Vishnu, and they consider Vishnu to be the highest of the gods. In fact, we'll talk about this in the next video, but they consider Vishnu to be the highest personal representation of Brahman. It's like the ultimate representation of Brahman choosing to become personal. So when Krishna is talking as God, he is seen as talking as Vishnu. This is the great god Vishnu speaking through Krishna. And something is said that is very interesting in the light of the fact that, first of all, there are many different schools of bhakti. There are many different gods that can be worshipped on the path. And there are other ways. There's karma yoga and jhanan and raja, and many ways that don't even involve bhakti. So there's many different paths to the goal. In Bhagavad Gita 4:11, this is all the same verse. As it says at the top there, I don't know if you've ever learned about different kinds of translations from original text, but there's different categories. There's formal translations, dynamic equivalents, paraphrases, and amplified versions. And I don't really want to go through all of the differences here, but let me just read a couple of these. In whatever way people surrender unto me, this is Vishnu speaking, I reciprocate with them accordingly. In other words, whatever way you want to have a relationship with me, or whatever spiritual discipline or path you choose, it's okay with me, I'll meet you there. Everyone follows my path, knowingly or unknowingly. In other words, whatever path you choose, even if you absolutely do not recognize it, it's still a path to Vishnu. Everything leads to Vishnu. All paths lead to him. The second one, as they approach me, so I receive them. All paths, Arjuna, lead to me. In the next one, people follow my paths in different ways. In the next one, many are the paths of men, but in the end they all come to me. In the next one, everyone follows my path in all respects. And again, this is knowingly or unknowingly. And the last one, and then I'll elaborate on this, as a person, this is the amplified, you can probably tell it adds some words to better explain the meaning. As a person takes refuge in me, I accordingly respond. Being the ultimate goal of all philosophies and doctrines. Let me say that one more time. Being the ultimate goal of all philosophies and doctrines, I am the objective to be attained by all. All men follow my paths. So what he's saying is every path comes to me. Other religions, other disciplines, worship of other gods, it doesn't matter. Vishnu is the one who is over it all. He's just the highest God, and all paths come to him. So if you want to think about it, let me just use a metaphor that's flawed, but let's imagine that you're coming to heaven, you're making your way to heaven. The person who is opening the door and saying, well done, welcome, opening the door for you is Vishnu and letting you in, even if you don't recognize it's him. Even if you've never recognized him or acknowledged him, your spiritual quest, your worship, whatever was directed elsewhere, that's okay. Vishnu takes great pleasure in helping you on your path, whether you realize it's him or not. And in the end, what everybody is looking for, despite their different conceptions or symbolism or understanding of religious path, what everybody is truly seeking is Vishnu. and they're following the paths that he has made to allow people to find him, and he's helping them on their way, whether they realize it's him or not. Now, here's what's beautiful about this. We have a number of concepts that we talk about, but we really can't even comprehend. Like, one is timelessness. How can you comprehend that? I need time to think, one thought in front of another and making conclusions. But another one is unconditional love. People talk about it, but there's no such thing. You know, you can say you love someone unconditionally, but I guarantee you there's something that person could do to cause you to change your mind. Maybe it's not within the scope of your conception that that person could ever do something that bad, but your love truly is not unconditional. It just isn't. In fact, even when monotheists talk about their God and, you know, drop the term unconditional love, it's like, wait. I have to accept you and I have to obey you and this and that, but if I rebel, it's like I go to hell, but otherwise I go to heaven. Those are called conditions. There's no such thing as unconditional love. We've never experienced it at all. But if unconditional love exists, just as timelessness exists, okay, even though we can't conceive of it, if it does exist, this looks like the closest example of it you could possibly come to. You've got a God who loves you so much that if you're honestly laboring and doing your best and you're being devoted and trying hard and stuff, then, you know, even if you've misunderstood everything and you don't even know he's the one that's helping you, he's going to help you anyway, just because he loves you. And he doesn't need you to recognize it. He doesn't need your approval. He doesn't need your praise. He doesn't need your thanks. He doesn't need anything from you. Now, see, when you need something, that's a condition. And in monotheism, however unconditional God's love is, at least humans have conceived of him as needing our praise, as it being absolutely required for us to glorify him and praise him. And but here you have a God that doesn't need it. Also in monotheism, it's also been stressed very much that you have to have a correct understanding of who God is and how he's revealed himself and how he works in your life and everything else. And there are some people that believe that you can't possibly make it to heaven unless you have that correct understanding. And again, this mitigates against that too. Someone who has an incorrect understanding but is laboring honestly and sincerely, Vishnu helps them, and he doesn't even need to be recognized as the one that's doing it. Well, that's something to think about, especially if you happen to be part of a monotheistic tradition like Christianity or Islam that has divisions that are actively trying to rethink their idea of the attributes of God and the character of God in an age where, of course, we have many new situations that necessitate us doing that. So this is something good to think about. Good example of unconditional love of Vishnu here that's presented in the Bhagavad Gita. That's all we have for this one. And it's been a pleasure. See you next time.